Good morning, and welcome to day 143 of F260 at First Baptist Meridian. Today we look at Nehemiah chapter 10. And by way of reminder, yesterday when we looked at Nehemiah 9, we said that we're bringing the Old Testament story, at least from a historical perspective, to a close. Nehemiah is smack dab in the middle of the Old Testament, and yet it closes out the Old Testament history in talking about what happened to those who returned from the exile. And of those who returned to the exile, we saw the importance of rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the city wall, beginning to rebuild the city itself. But in the past few days, we've seen this recommitment to the covenant. Starting with Nehemiah chapter 8, where Ezra reads the law for the people and they celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. We saw this yesterday in chapter 9. When you essentially have the entire Old Testament story from creation, covenant to exile summarized. And the end of that, starting with 36, when they say, God, yes, we are back in the land, but we are here as slaves. We have foreign overlords to whom we give taxes and offerings from the abundance of the land. So they're home, but it's not really home. It's a story that's being resolved, but in an unresolved way. And so they're still hoping that God will fully restore and bring to fulfillment all the promises made to their forefathers. And you see their commitment to that, I think, today in chapter 10 with this oath that they take. In fact, it's referenced at the very last verse of chapter 9, verse 38, says, in view of all this, we are making a binding agreement in writing on a sealed document containing the names of our leaders, Levites, and priests. And then chapter 10 begins, and most of chapter 10 is a record of the names of those whose seals were on that document. And you could kind of compare this to the Declaration of Independence. On the one hand, the Declaration of Independence was on behalf of all of the American colonists, declaring their independence from Britain. On the other hand, there was a special degree of vulnerability and leadership for those whose names physically appeared on the document. So even those who didn't sign the document were on board with independence, or certainly accountable for rebelling against Britain. But there was a special liability and a special leadership to those who had signed the Declaration of Independence. Again, they're trying to lead the entire nation in renewing the covenant, returning to the Lord and to his law, so that they can be that light to the nations. And from that, the leaders, the Levites, the priestly families take the initiative of signing this. And most of what they're signing has already been, stated in the law, but it's precisely the parts of the law that they did not keep and which led them astray, intermarrying with foreign women. Again, we talked about this with Solomon, right? God takes his people out of Egypt. Solomon brings Egypt right back into the heart of God's people by marrying Pharaoh's daughter, by honoring the Sabbath. And I want to Sabbath not just on a week-to-week basis, but also the Sabbath year, something we don't have much on in the Old Testament in terms of it being honored and observed, leaving the land uncultivated in the seventh year and canceling every debt. You see this concept, by the way, appear in the Lord's Prayer, which I've been preaching on Sundays in the New Testament. We tend to quote it as, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. But the literal language of the prayer as found in Matthew is, forgive us our debts, even as we have forgiven those indebted to us. This forgiving of debts was a recognition that regardless of economic transactions in the short term, ultimately the land was the Lord's, which is why it was to rest as God rested in creation, which is why debts were to be forgiven. And so they're committing these things, which are precisely the things they got wrong the first time around, as we've talked about. And they're doing so in a way where the leaders take the initiative so that they can lead all the people in restoring the covenant, anticipating Yahweh's return and the fulfillment of his promises. We'll continue on this more tomorrow. In the meantime, keep reading, reflecting, and responding to God's word, and God bless you as you do so.